As Daniel presented me, I'm the project manager with the Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance. And we're a nonprofit organization, so basically we try to protect our Petitcodiac watershed through education, community engagement, and science. These are some of the topics I'll be covering. So abiotic non-living things, aquatic environments, biotic living things, impact of water quality, invasive and alien species, anthropogenic impacts, watershed monitoring that we do out in the field here, and solutions to some of our problems that we have in the area. So first of all, let's just have an overview of what is a watershed. So a watershed is an area of land in which all water drains to a common destination. So it's an area that can actually retain or store water, which is described in its name, watershed. It includes all the highest peaks of the land surrounding it. It also includes all the highest saddles between these peaks. So any drops of rain that fall within this boundary will run down to the valley through lakes, our rivers and streams, through our wetlands. They also infiltrate in our groundwater. They flow through our estuaries and make their way to bays and oceans. So this is just the example of the Petitcodiac watershed. It covers the areas of Memramcook area, as well as the Greater Moncton area, which includes also Turtle Creek, where our reservoir is, our drinking water. It also includes all the way up to the Petitcodiac and Elgin areas as well. So it stretches quite a ways, and it's the third largest watershed in the province. So some of the aquatic environments we can find in our watershed. So we have lakes and ponds, and I'll just make kind of like a difference between the two. Normally we would think ponds are smaller than lakes, which is generally true. But also there's another thing that we look at is all about light penetration. So basically in lakes, light won't penetrate all the way through. It'll just end up in the photic zone, we call, and they have a portion of the very bottom of the lake that is aphotic. So the light can't get to it, and so photosynthesizing plants won't survive at the way bottom, so they'll grow mainly on the edges of a lake. Versus a pond, light can actually penetrate all the way through the bottom, so plant will grow all the way across its substrate in this case. And we also have many different wetlands in our watershed, some of them being fed only by rain, such as bogs, making them quite acidic, versus fens that are less acidic, which are fed by rainwater but also groundwater. And some of our wetlands will have running water through them, like shallow water, meadows, swamps, and marshes. Oops, sorry, I went too quick there. We also have vernal pools in the area, mainly in our floodplains, and these are fed by snow melts. We also have forested wetlands in the same area where we have mature trees growing. And we obviously have coastal wetlands, which are influenced by our tidal waters. So salted or brackish water will impact these areas. And we have obviously our rivers and streams, so they're naturally flowing water courses, usually fresh water, but in some cases, like our Nort River in the Petitcodiac Watershed, is naturally salted, not to levels where fish will survive in them. So the levels of salt is not high enough, but it comes from our rocky minerals. So rivers will flow through the valleys, between all the way across what we call floodplains, and they can stretch quite a ways in the valley. So on each side of it will be our valley walls, and so rivers changes quite a bit over the years. So they'll make their way and make a channel within this floodplain, and it varies seasonally. So in the summertime, we can have actually less water flowing through this channel, but it mainly follows the lowest point of the valley all the way through. And we also have riparian zones that borders these waterways. So these are transitional zones between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So they kind of buffer all of the activities that we have on our land and what actually impacts our waterways. So to have a good mixture of water-loving plants and terrestrial plants between these activities is preferable. Obviously, we can't forget our groundwater and aquifers. They are the areas where water penetrates our soils to get to them and replenish them. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. But this is where mainly people that live in rural areas will get their water for their wells. And so they also get their water from there, but they also actually replenish the rivers. And of course, our rivers take many different forms, different patterns. They can be straight, meandering, braided, and anastomosing. In New Brunswick, we mainly have what we call meandering, so this kind of snake-like pattern that you see in the diagram. And rivers are ever changing, so they will kind of create these patterns as they run down the land. So our fluvial processes is basically kind of transporting all of our sediments down to the land, and forming, or actually just creating deposition and erosion in the area, as you can see. You'll have erosion mainly on the outer bends of meanders, or where there's exposed lands, if there's not enough vegetation covering the land and holding on to that soil. But where there's erosion, there's also deposition, so this loose sediment will have to land somewhere, and they mainly deposit in the inner part of meanders. And we also have the formation of pools on the outer edge of meanders mainly. And between these pools, we'll have riffles, which is our fast-flowing water, and our runs that are a slower running water. So watershed health can be monitored different ways, and they're impacted basically by different activities that we do on the surrounding land, and how what kind of activities can impact our waterways, one of them being our recreational activities. It can be agriculture's activities, or industrial, or residential activities as well. But our waterways are also impacted by our water quantity, so how much water we have running through them, and our water quality. So water quantity is how much water is moving through our system. Human practices can change that, and these are some examples to that. So for clear cutting, for example, it actually gives the inability for environment to absorb precipitation and actually creates less transpiration, so kind of basically less rainwater that comes down. Or sometimes it can be too much rain too. It'll encourage more runoffs if there's not enough vegetation to absorb that water coming down. Industrial practices also. If, for example, like a company that provides water to the public by bottling water, they can sometimes actually run a lake dry if they're not careful. And some of the consequences to too much or too little water, we have infrastructure damages often when we have flooding. In periods of drought, we can have risk of blue-green algae blooms to develop in our streams, or even our lakes, actually. If we're not very careful with our water conservation, we can sometimes actually have a risk of blue-green algae in our reservoir if the water gets too low. And of course, if there's not enough water, we can lose some of our fauna or flora, biodiversity. And of course, our water quality also impacts our environment. We have certain species that are very sensitive to water parameter changes, such as temperature, dissolved oxygen, the acidity, and salinity as well. If we have turbid water as well, that can also impact some of our predators to find their food. And bacteria as well. If we have, if we have too much bacteria, it can develop into E. coli as well, which can bring a lot of health issues. So some examples of consequences of bad water quality in our waterways. We have water contamination that can bring stress and illnesses to our wildlife. Eutrophication, which is the excess of nutrients leaching into our waterways and having too much plants grow in certain areas and actually taking too much of the dissolved oxygen away from fish, for example. So some of our living things that we have in our watersheds. So we have many different kinds of wildlife, going from aquatic plants, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And all of these can be impacted by the water quality. And of course, in our ecosystem can only carry so many species. It can only offer so much resources, whether it's food, water, oxygen, or space. So just to give you an example of a fishbowl, so if we have a species of fish living in it, they'll eventually multiply, reproduce, so their populations are going to go up. And eventually, if there's too much of the population, there's not enough food or water or oxygen and space for them eventually, so you might have some of your population decreasing in some cases. And eventually the environment will kind of find its balance to only support so many species in it. And sustaining our aquatic population. So basically, to have a healthy waterway, generally these are some of the rules to sustain a healthy ecosystem in them. So cold water is very important for fish, for example. Having clear water is good. Having your water highly oxygenated as well. Having minimal nutrients input coming from land activities such as like agriculture. So that can be like fertilizers and that leaches in. Also, deep and shallow sections in your rivers are very important because we have species that prefer deeper waters where it's usually colder, and shallow water are also great for invertebrates. They prefer those areas as well. And obviously to have proper buffer zones. So a wider buffer zone is preferable with a well-mixed vegetation of trees, shrubs, and uncut grass mixed all together. One alone is not enough. They really need all three to hold on to that soil together. Some of the biological indicators we can look at to determine the health and conditions of our streams. Some of them being macroinvertebrates. These are just examples of pictures of them. So some species are actually more sensitive to pollutants, and if we have a lot of these sensitive species, it means our waterways are actually very healthy. If we have more of the tolerant to pollutants, then your waterway is probably not as healthy. So we kind of need to intervene, try to help it out in this cases. And some program to evaluate these organisms that we've used in the past are the Canadian Aquatic Biomonitoring Network, so CABIN for short. And also we've been doing monitorings on freshwater mussels as well. Let's look at some of the impacts of water quality on our wildlife. So if we have too much pollutant entering our waterways, it can impact our sensitive species of macroinvertebrates. So we might lose some of those. But we do have predators for that species feeding on those that might get impacted as well if we lose these in our waterways. But some species actually can feed on other types that are possibly more tolerant to pollutants, but they can't only survive on one species alone, so we might lose some amphibians, for example. But eventually, you can't just survive on that one type of food, so you might not get all your nutrition, so we might also lose certain species of fish, which eventually impacts our higher up predators such as hawks and eagles. And of course, if there's no predators for some of the macroinvertebrates, then their population will definitely go up quite a bit. But then eventually they eat up all of the resources as well, and they can actually die off. But of course, our food web is more complicated than that, so there's a lot of options, but every year we do have species that we lose because of water quality. This just being an example, so these are species at risk statuses through Sarah and Kusowick. So we have different levels of risk, extinct being the first one, so completely wiped out from our planet. But we also have extirpated, that can be wiped out from a country but still exist in another country. And of course, we have endangered, threatened, special concern, that where we start seeing population kind of decrease, and of course not at risk at all. And this is just an example of the dwarf wedge mussels, which we have identified in our Petitcodiac watershed. But this one has been extirpated from our waterways, unfortunately. So it was impacted by the build of the causeway that was built over 50 years now. And we lost this species because it prevented some of its fish, his host fish, to swim upstream and actually secure their reproduction of carrying their larvae upstream. And this is just an example. I won't go all through this, but this is just a list of the species at risk found in our province in New Brunswick. And one of them being the innervate of Fundy Atlantic salmon, which is endangered, which obviously was impacted by the causeway in our watershed. We also have the wood turtle, which is threatened by many of our human activities surrounding their habitat. such as agriculture um, and deforestation as well. And also the striped bass, which is considered still endangered, that was also impacted in our waterways. Now I'll be covering some of the invasive and alien species. So an alien species is basically a species that was brought in to a place where it never existed before. So it was introduced. However, some of these species can outcompete some of our native species. And so when they start out competing, they become invasive. So they spread easily and kind of take away of the resources of other species. So the native species are more at risk. They're more at risk of dying off because of this expansion of their populations. Oh, that was just examples of the smallmouth bass, the purple loosestrife in wetlands, and the European starling. And how do these invasive species be introduced in these areas? Well, these are just examples of it. So from ship ballast that drains into our waterways through people, accidentally or purposely, and also exotic pet trades. These are just examples of groups that we, as a nonprofit organization, work with, whether it's governmental or non-governmental organization. So we try to work all together to mitigate these issues. And I'll be covering some of the anthropogenic impacts in our waterways. One of them being usage of water for crop irrigation, for example. So water quantity, as I mentioned before, is super important. So we really have to be careful of our usage of the water, especially in drought seasons, which can lower the amount of water so much so that blue-green algae can develop in our water supplies or in our streams, making it very possible to make us sick or even our animals. Also salt intrusions in wells. If you have a house that is near the coastline, if you use too much of your water and you're not very careful of conserving it, you might eventually get salt intrusions in your wells. So we really have to be mindful of water conservation, and these are just some examples of what ourselves we can do. So just quick showers are an example, fix our leaky faucets, high efficiency appliance, irrigate our gardens early or late in the day, have rain barrels to capture some of the rain water, or even just be careful not letting the tap run when you're brushing your teeth or something like that. So there's many different ways to do that. Other ones that I can list for you, so impermeable surfaces, especially in urban areas. We have a lot of parking lots, a lot of roads that doesn't let water penetrate through our soils and replenish our groundwater. So a lot of this big rain events, the water actually just runs off the soil or these surfaces and create floods often. Or also carries a lot of pollutants and leaching them through our waterways. Also, for agriculture and farming, a lot of topsoil pesticides, fertilizers can leach into our waterways if there's not a sufficient buffer zone to capture those before entering our waterways. Also, cutting vegetation in our buffer zones. So if we cut too much of what's holding on to the soil together, we can reduce the bank stability. And so this is in situations where people start losing land as well. Fording sites are another issue. So it creates a lot of sedimentation, erosion, habitat destructors as well. So fording sites are basically the traffic that drives through rivers directly. So it's preferable to use bridges to cross rivers than versus driving directly into it. Having improper placed culverts as well can be an issue for fish passage. They often aren't necessarily placed the right way, or often what happens, they've been there for so many years, and with all of the storms that we've had, they've ended up changing quite a bit. So fish passage can be either partially or full barriers. In this cases, we have to try and work with DTI to improve the water levels for fish to still be able to swim upstream to spawn. And also landfills and water wastes that are kind of thrown near our streams and that. They introduce microplastics in our environment, and chemicals as well leaching into our waterways can be a big problem for our wildlife. Water treatment facilities and house septic systems need to be updated regularly to make sure that we have less nutrients accessing our waters. And also we're going to go through a bit of the watershed monitoring that we've been working on over the years. So we've done a lot of outreach with some of our younger generations. We've been going to schools, all kinds of display events to educate some of our younger generations, but also just general public and our landowners as well, just to make sure that everyone's aware of the problems that are out there and what we can do to help, right? We've also been doing this for several years, over 20 years now. We've been monitoring water quality. We've been looking at chemical, physical, and biological characteristics of the water. Some of it we head out to the field with our devices to measure the temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity, salinity, turbidity, and total dissolved solids. And we also take some samples at predetermined sites that we have and bring it back to our lab to measure the nitrates and phosphates, which would be the extra nutrients coming out from fertilizers or pesticides. We look also at bacteria levels, such as E. coli, which can be an issue when it comes to recreational activities in our waters. We've been also doing in the past some macroinvertebrate identification, just looking kind of at the health of our river through these bioindicators. We've monitored as well freshwater mussels. They're so important in our waterways. They help clean our waters as they are bivalve, so they filter feed. And they can filter up to 5 liters an hour. And they feed on algae and bacteria, which is super important for ourselves and our wildlife. This is an example on the right of a brook floater, which is a species of special concern that we've been trying to protect with our landowners. And of course, a lot of our macroinvertebrates are very sensitive to human activities. Another project of ours is Broken Brooks. We've been evaluating culverts and working with DTI to evaluate fish passage and habitat connectivity. So we've been evaluating if they're passable, if they're partial or full barriers to them, and if they are, what kind of method we can use to mitigate these. We've also been evaluating our fish species. So even during Broken Brooks, we evaluate before and after some of our restoration work to see if our methods are working to help them out swim upstream. So we've been using seine fishing that was recommended by one of our board members that is a biologist, and he prefers that we use this versus the electrofishing, just because we have a lot of our fish that have parasites and can be more vulnerable if they're exposed to being shocked with the electrofisher. Some of those solutions we can do, even as landowners or general public, whether we use our waterways as recreational. So to leave a proper distance of riparian zone of uncut grass, bushes, and trees, as I mentioned before. We can build fences and an extra water supply for our farm animals to avoid some of the degradation at our riverbanks. Also reduce the use of fertilizers and toxic pesticides on our gardens and lawns to avoid it leaching into our waterways. Dispose of litter accordingly. Maintain septic systems regularly if you're in rural areas. Appropriately dispose of chemical products as well. Use designated stream crossings, such as bridge, like I mentioned earlier. These are ways that can help quite a lot on our waterways and our habitats. Another popular solutions is adding more green infrastructures instead of gray infrastructures. So these have been proven to help a lot on stormwater management. So we've been working with a lot of our partners across Riverview, Memram Cook, Moncton, Dieppe, to add more green infrastructures. So these green infrastructures will help manage some of the, when it comes to big rain events, like our rain gardens, for example. They're a good mixture of soil and water-loving plants. So mainly where we know there's usually a lot of flooding, it can capture some of that water and filter it before it actually leaches into our waterways. So it prevents a lot of those problems to happen. Also, if you have the opportunity to make a green roof on a new building, we encourage that a lot. And rain barrels is another way of taking some of our rainwater to prevent some of the flooding, but also all the runoffs coming from our roof can be captured to water some of our gardens or flower beds. And of course, permeable surfaces, if you're able to leave either crushed stone, sand, in some areas where you know it floods, it lets the rain kind of penetrate our soils to replenish our groundwater. Also improving our habitat connectivity. We've been working a lot with DTI, as I mentioned before. These are some of the solutions we've been working with. We've been building rock weirs and these outflow chutes that is like a very luxurious fish slide. And it helps kind of to elevate the levels of water for the fish to better pass these culverts that have, I guess, a big drop of water. I don't know the term I was looking for there, but basically certain species can't necessarily use all of their energy to jump up a big waterfall. So we try to encourage putting these installment if DTI is not going to change these culverts within the next 5 years. So we kind of go out and install these to help them out. We also work with a lot of our landowners by improving our bank stability by revegetation of our riparian zones, so the buffer zones. We've been planting a lot of trees, shrubs. We've been adding a lot of tree cuttings as well. and try to slow down some of the water coming down from those rivers where it has severe erosions. And we always encourage volunteers to join us to these events. We've had so many over the years. So some of our volunteers have been participating in some of our citizen science days. So coming out with us to monitor some of our streams. We've also had a lot of tree planting events and garbage cleanups as well. Another way that we can help is to practice some zero waste habits. So just by being more careful ourselves to avoid using some single-use plastics or using reusable straws or reusable bags are great examples of just small things that we can do, and it makes quite a big difference in avoiding having all of these a lot of trash ending up in our waterways. And if you guys have any questions, you can always follow us on our social media and our website as well. And let me just switch here to see if anyone had any questions at all for me today.
All right, thank you so much, Darlene. That's really interesting information, and it's so great that the Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance is doing this type of work and research. If anyone has any questions, then please ask them either in the chat or the questions tab. While we're waiting to see if anybody does, I have a question or two. So I'm just wondering, for people who notice issues in one of their local watersheds, be it pollution or maybe a motorized vehicle crossing where a lot of siltation is getting, injected into the river system, where can people reach out to? Who can they contact about this?
Definitely, they can. Well, definitely, we're always ready to help out people. We try to work with a lot of landowners or ATV groups for the crossings, for example, or with DTI when it comes to culvert issues. So sometimes it's nice to have people notice things for us. They can always reach us out to us, and we can always make a good contact with whoever would deal with those. So, I mean, just for culvert examples, if you notice that there's a big outflow drop that a fish can't pass, then definitely call us. Like, we can definitely help out because we might have not noticed it before or had the time to mitigate those issues. And it goes for everything. If you have any erosion happening on your land, we're ready to help out all of our landowners as best as we can. As a nonprofit organization, we tend to get a lot of our funding through governmental or non-governmental groups, and we can apply for this kind of work to be done. So we can partner with a lot of our landowners on this. I don't know if you had, I forgot to put my the phone number there, but definitely look it up on our website. All of our information is there to contact us. You can email us, send us messages on Facebook anytime. Let me see here. I think there was one question from Cheryl Thomas. Do the monitors eventually fall off? Oh, no, that was a previous question. Sorry. Thought that was. Oh, here, okay. So the first question from Alexis Leger, for the fish ladders, is it something you use often? What indicate a culvert need, or what it need when it needs one? Okay, so there's always different situations. It's a case-by-case thing. So we don't always use fish ladders. Sometimes adding just a rock weir at the very bottom might help. And maybe sometimes it's a combination of both rock weir and fish ladders to kind of help elevate some of this water for the fish to kind of just have that extra little help to jump over that obstacle. But we find that by adding those fish ladders, it's been very successful in Nova Scotia, and we've been trying to adopt it here in the province as well. It actually has, so the slide is very narrow, but there's also what we call baffles with it, and we also install baffles in behind as well to help capture some of the water before it ends up on the other side of the culvert, so that it kind of helps elevate the water on both sides there for fish to pass that obstacle. But we've been installing 2 so far. We still have some future, so we're hoping to really adopt this method here in New Brunswick. Because we've only installed our first one last year, and we've installed another one this year. There's a second question there. Is there a similar group for Memramcook Watershed? There is. Well, ourselves, actually, Memramcook does fall into our boundary, so we do work with Memramcook quite a bit. We do monitor their water quality in that area as well. So if there's any issues in that area, you're very free to contact us about it. There are also Fort Folly recovery, habitat recovery. Sorry, I said it wrong there. That is quite near there as well. They work in our watershed as well. They are situated in Dorchester, I believe, and also the Petitcodiac River Keepers we've been working a lot with. I don't know if there was any. I'm going to check in the chat too.
Yeah, and actually, I have one other question, if I can ask one.
Sure.
Yep. I'm just wondering, runoff from commercial forestry operations, if you see any issues there with respect to water quality.
Well, definitely if there are trees cut in within the buffer zone, and there's not a lot of trees buffering our big rain events, definitely it can leach into our waterways. I haven't seen personally myself a lot, but I know there is some in our watershed. Did that kind of answer your question? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, I think so. So it's
okay.
Positive to see that you're not seeing any major impacts there.
Yeah, I mean, certain areas where we're going, a lot of it is, there's a lot more agriculture, I think, versus forestry. But yeah, definitely we need to improve a lot of our buffer zones.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. And thank you again for your presentation. We had a few technical issues at the start there, but it all came together. Lots of really fantastic information.
Great.
I've had the opportunity to work with Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance on a few occasions, and their work is nothing short of inspiring. So if you're interested to learn more about them, then please do check out their website and social media. I posted the links in the chat room.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
See ya.